Okay, so hi everybody. Welcome to the sort of Pressbooks and SBCTC session about institutional buy-ins and accessibility. My name is Amy. I am the Customer Success Manager at Pressbooks. Thank you so much to everyone for joining us. There's a big crowd of you. And we'll do our best to answer any questions that you may have. I am most familiar with sort of the technical side. I answer all the emails that come through Pressbooks. I tend to answer, but I am joined here today by our sales exec, Sarah Simpson. Sorry, this is the end of the Montreal working day, and tripping over my words a little bit. I know it's only 1 p.m., so hopefully my words are making sense. But yes, I'm joined by our sales exec, Sarah, who will answer a lot of your questions on the contract side and pricing and other things. She's sort of an expert in all of these things. So she will be joining me for the first part of the session. And our product manager, Steele, who is very well versed in the world of accessibility and other and more detailed aspects of educational content, will be joining us in about, like I said, about 20 minutes. So I will let Sarah introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Sarah. As Amy mentioned, I am the sales executive here at Pressbooks. I've got a few things to go over with you today, such as what the different buying options are for Pressbooks and what's available to you. So I would be the person that you would connect with if you wanted to opt into a Pressbooks network for your institution, or if you have questions about how to get access to Pressbooks potentially through the state board as well. So I guess I can dive into some things with you. So one of the things that Boyoung wanted me to go over today was how you would go about accessing Pressbooks, whether it's through acquiring your own institutional network or going in through the state board route. Now, I realize I'm kind of jumping right into the contracting stage, but I just, it might be hard to do a little poll here. But how many of you are familiar with Pressbooks, or rather, how many of you are not familiar with Pressbooks? And if you aren't familiar with Pressbooks, perhaps I can go into a little bit more detail on what our offer is. All right, I can see a hand raised there from Susan. And we've got a few people in the chat who are not familiar with Pressbooks at all. Okay, so all right, before I dive into the contract, maybe I can speak a little bit to what Pressbooks is, what you get with a Pressbooks network, and we can dive into that. So let me just pull up a few links on my end, and then I can share my screen. So it'll just take just a moment here. All right, so I will just give you a quick and brief overview before we dive into what contracts look like. Okay, so when you opt into Pressbooks for your institution, what you can do is you can purchase a Pressbooks network that can be branded to your school. And it's a custom platform that you can customize and change the colors around and brand it however you'd like. And this is where people would come to learn more about your publishing program on campus, what work you've been doing in OER, where they could sign into the Pressbooks network, or where they could discover some books that have been produced by the network. So what Pressbooks is at its core, it's a content development platform. So if you're producing and authoring OER, you would use Pressbooks to write and publish that content. You can also use Pressbooks to build courseware as well. So we are integrated with H5P if you want to build out interactive activities. You have all of that functionality within Pressbooks. So You have the option to purchase your own standalone network for your institution. You also have the option as an individual faculty member, if you just wanted to get a single license for yourself, that's also a possibility. And then the third option here is that the Washington State Board for Community Technical Colleges also has its own standalone Pressbooks network that you have the option to buy into at a lower rate than what it would be if you were to buy your own individual network. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment here. But essentially what you're producing on Pressbooks is this concept of a web book. So I've navigated over here to the Rebus Communities Pressbooks Network, and I'm currently on one of their books landing pages here. So this is where people would come to read the OER material, get some more information about the book, such as a quick summary. There's a little button down here where they can go to read the book, or they can scroll through the table of contents and skip ahead through there. This author has also enabled download options for their readers. So they've surfaced a number of different download formats that are available for offline reading, and also formats that enable others to download this and remix it for future use. So this particular book is using a Creative Commons license that facilitates being able to adapt it for your course, for example. So if I were to click through read book here, it's going to bring me to the first section of the book. If I'd rather go through the table of contents, I have access to it up here, and I can go through and say, you know what, maybe I want to skip ahead to chapter 5 here and go read through that. I also see that this chapter is using our glossary tool as well, which you can kind of have all the definitions populate right then and there within your text. And then the navigating from page to page would be done on this bottom bar down here. So if I were to go to the next page, I could, and I'd read into the next chapter. And you can embed videos, you can embed different media files in here. You can link away to other articles if you wanted to, and you can embed, like I had mentioned, H5P activities. So this particular book is using H5P in 2 different ways. So what they've done is they've got 2 sections at the end of their book, a part for chapter quizzes and a part for lecture slides. Now this instructor could have embedded these activities directly into the chapter itself, but just for organizational purposes, they chose to have these in a different section. So at the bottom of each chapter, they link away to where the quizzes are. So if I'm going to scroll down quickly, I think I'll show you that before the references here. They also have the link here. So I could have navigated there from the nav bar, or I could just click through as a student, and it's going to bring me to the quiz that has been built on H5P. So this is where the student can go through and test their knowledge, see if they understood the chapter, and go on from there. Now, the instructor has also included lecture slides to go along with all of the content in the book. So the student can go through and just have access to all of that course content in one place. So this is just a little bit about how a student might go about interacting with a web book, and just to give you an idea of what kind of content you are producing on Pressbooks. Now, the other thing that would be relevant probably for many of you would be let's go to the Pressbooks directory here. We've got a directory of all of the open content that has been produced by other institutions using Pressbooks. So right now this directory is pulling from almost 100 networks. We're getting up there. We're getting more networks added every single week here, with more books being added to this. And this is where you can go through and discover some content that's coming out of different institutions. You can search through by keywords if you had a particular subject you were interested in. And the reason I wanted to show you this is because this is free and open to everyone. So it's a great tool to search and discover content that is free to use within your course and will be freely available to your students. Now, if you had your own Pressbooks network, or if you had access to a Pressbooks network, you would be able to take any of the content you're finding in here, anything that is openly licensed, and you would be able to make a full copy of that text and pull it into your Pressbooks network, and then you could edit and remix it from there. So just to give, I guess, a quick peek as to what that would look like. Sorry, I'll try to keep this brief because I know we've got a lot to discuss today, but just for those of you who don't know a lot about Pressbooks, I just wanted to make sure that I was sharing it. So what I've done right here is I've logged into a Pressbooks network. This is what the back end looks like. So if you're familiar with WordPress, this might look a little familiar to you because Pressbooks is built on top of WordPress. Anyway, so what you can do if you found a book in that directory that you would like to reuse for your course and maybe make some edits to, we've got this clone a book feature here where you could just take the URL of the original book. You could decide what you want the URL of your book on your network to be. And then if you were to leave this section blank here, it's just going to pull over the original title of the book. Now, the cloning process can take anywhere from 30 seconds to about 5 minutes. If you're working with a really large text, sometimes it can take a little bit longer than that. I think I cloned a book over from Lumen Learning, who's also built their platform on top of Pressbooks. So their material is clonable. I cloned over one of their boundless anatomy and physiology texts, which was quite large. So it took a little bit longer. So I can actually show you what that looks like. So all I did was I took the link to the text from the Lumen Learning site because it's built on top of Pressbooks and it was openly licensed. I was able to clone that into my Pressbooks network. And then I got all of the content of that entire text. And you can see there's a number of chapters in here. And then I have the full ability to edit and adapt all of these chapters. So if I go into this organize section here, I can go through the chapters, I can drag and drop, move them around if I want to, I can delete them entirely, I can click into them and edit and change the entire structure of the book. So let's say I wanted to get rid of all of this. I absolutely could. If I wanted to change this this paragraph and move it down here, I definitely could. Not that that would make sense for the, the way this book flows, but I just want to give you an example of once you clone it in here, you have full access to this editing interface. So you can change it and make it and reshape it for your course. So if you wanted to take a book that already exists out there and use Pressbooks to maybe make this book a little bit more interactive, you could go in and you could add let's say we wanted to add an H5P activity in here. I haven't created any H5P content for this book. I would have to do that from the H5P hub down here. Let me just leave this without saving. And with every Pressbooks network, what you have access to is you have full access to the H5P hub. So you can create an unlimited amount of interactive activities that you can embed. So similar to what that community psychology text was doing with course presentations and multiple choice questions for their students, you can put anything you'd like from this hub into your book. And there's also ways that you can pull H5P content from any other openly licensed text, and if they're using H5P, you can download their content and then upload it directly within this hub and then embed it into your course. So that was my attempt at giving you a very high level overview of a little bit more about what you can do with Pressbooks and how it could work for you. One of the main reasons I'm here in this call today is to share a little bit more about what the pricing is and the pricing structure and your buying options. So as I mentioned, you have the option to purchase your own institutional license for your school, or you have the option to buy in through the State Board for Community Technical Colleges. And I just wanted to speak to that quickly since we did coordinate this with Bo Young. So I've got a document here that I can share with all of you after this call if you'd like, just for some more information on pricing. So our base price for a Pressbooks network for an institution, if you were to go and opt in to purchase this outside of the State Board, it would be $10,000 annually, whereas we've got some slightly more advantageous pricing through the State Board, where it's priced at $1 per FTE with a cap on the maximum price there. So by default, if you have a really large college, the max you'll ever pay is going to be $7,000 for that buy-in. So rather than $10,000, you're already seeing the benefit of a 30% discount there. Whereas, for example, LW Tech, who recently bought into the state board network here, they had an FTE count of about 3,300. So again, that was priced at $1 per FTE. So their annual fees were $3,300. So you can see that that's quite a big difference from if they were to go through and purchase their own network at $10,000. So I just wanted to highlight that. And the things that you would get access to is you would have full access to the network to produce an unlimited amount of content. You'll have full access to that H5P hub, and you can really get your OER program off the ground, or any publishing program that you have. Let's see, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that when you do buy into a central network, the central network is going to be branded to the network owner. So in this case, it is the Washington State Board who owns the Pressbooks network. So rather than having the network itself branded to your institution, it will be branded to the state board. So that's one of the trade-offs you'll see if you're buying into a central network instead of choosing to have your own. The other thing that I would mention is that when you're buying into a central network, this does include SSO. So that's single sign-on for those who might not be familiar with what that is. And that's just a way to access a network. So I'll just give an example here with eCampus Ontario. eCampus Ontario is a consortium that has a central network that is available for all higher ed institutions within the province of Ontario in Canada. And this is where those schools can come to gain access to this network. So for anyone who has bought into this network, when they go to sign in, what they can do is they can choose to sign in with their NetID using SSO. So rather than just having a username and password that they could set up if they chose to, they can choose instead to simply use their NetID for login. So an example here, if I were to click through institutional login, let's say I'm from Brock University, I would simply click on my university up here, and then it will bring me to the university's landing page for single sign-on. So then I could just log in with my student ID and password or faculty ID and password to gain access to the network here. So that's something that's included with the buy-in options to a central network. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to share with you today. I didn't have a chance to look at the chat. Sorry, I hope Amy was keeping an eye on that while I was presenting
so
here.
the questions started sort of flooding in. So Heather asked a great question, which said, what happens if a college buys into Pressbooks? You write a book, then the college does not continue with the subscription to Pressbooks. Will you still have access to the books you created, and do others also still have access to the books? So I had summarized saying we'd figure out a solution, but I said that you can answer this question better, so I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, so there's, I guess, two pieces here. So if you were to buy into the state board's network and you only paid for a 1-year subscription, essentially once that subscription lapses, you would lose access to the authoring and editing platform, but your content would not be deleted. So any openly licensed content that you have up on that network could still live on and continue to live on the network. Now, if, for example, the Washington State Board decided to cancel their subscription, then what happens? In that case, what we would do is we'd make sure that all users on the network have access to all of the download files and the opportunity to download those files of their texts. And then they could, if they wanted to opt for their own network in the future or go with a kind of single faculty author license, they could pull that content into their own account that they've purchased. The other option that we are making available to anyone who does have to cancel a subscription is we are offering to host any openly licensed content at no charge in perpetuity. So if a network can no longer afford to continue their subscription, we don't want the OER community to lose all of those great resources. So when Amy said we would find a solution to keep that content accessible online, we are very much committed to that. So before we would take down the network in that case, what we would do is we would make sure that we pulled all of that content into a network that is going to stay up and running, so one that Pressbooks owns and operates, and just have a way to keep all of that content available for people beyond when the subscription lapses.
Okay, and there's another question. which says which SSO protocols does that work with? So I think Steele is on this call, so he might be able to better answer this question. But if you're working out of a central system, we use Open Athens OIDC. So it would come out of that, but we would be able to, no matter what you're using. So for other consortia, there are some schools under some consortia that use SAML, some that use CAS, some that don't use either. So we would be able to accommodate for everybody. But Steele, if you'd like to answer that further, please feel free to chime in. And there you go. Yes, Steele said we support SAML2, CAS, and OIDC. And Jessica asks, regarding the state board pricing of $1 per FTE, is this an annual fee or a one-time fee?
That would be an annual fee. And then I see a question in there about math and science books being accessible. So maybe I will let Steele later on in this call speak more to accessibility, but there could be something that I could demo for you guys, which is MathJax, which enables you to produce accessible web math notation so that it can be read by screen readers and assistive technologies. So let me just pull up a quick example of a text that has a lot of math in it, and then I can share my screen here. So we've got a text here that has a number of different equations written throughout. So MathJax enables you to author math equations in an accessible way. So rather than having to embed, for example, screenshots or images into your text, you can author this using shortcodes. If you're familiar with LaTeX, that works, or MathML. And what we mean by when we say this is accessible is not only can it be read by screen readers, but there are also some accessibility settings built right in. So if I were to right click on this equation, I have some settings that I can play around with. So let's say I had a hard time reading really tiny exponents. One of the settings that I might want to use, oops, sorry, I navigated away there, would be a zoom trigger. So in this case, on this book, I've set up click to zoom, and I've set my zoom factor to 200%. So whenever I click on an equation throughout this chapter or throughout this book, what it does is it expands it for me. So it makes it a little bit easier to read. And then the highlighting you're seeing here is this book has Hypothesis enabled, which allows you to do web annotation and highlighting. So your students can treat their books like they could print books and take notes in the margins and highlight through the content from there. And when they do highlight the text, it doesn't highlight it for everyone. It would be specific to their particular account. I've got a little Hypothesis account set up myself, so I'm just seeing the notes that are the ones that I've created, not that other students have created on this book. All right, sorry, I just wanted to jump in on that one quickly.
And there's another question which says, is there a cost for H5P LTI to LMS for different colleges and students for grade passback feature? So there's a lot of different elements in there.
Yes, so in that pricing proposal, which I will make available to all of you after this call, there is an annual fee for connecting your LMS to the Pressbooks network via LTI. So this would enable you to pull content into your LMS. And then once you have that LTI connection established, you can opt into using what we call Pressbooks results for LMS. So that enables you to connect the H5P activities that you've built within Pressbooks into your LMS gradebook so that you can start recording student performance on the various activities that you've embedded throughout your text.
Awesome. And I also see that there are, so Steele answered the question about accessibility, just because he's the master. And if you have any other questions about accessibility, we will go into that in a little bit. We're running a little bit behind time because there's so many people with wonderful questions. And there's one question that says, so that hypothesis enabled, is that hypothesis enabled directly via the Pressbooks text, not a browser add-on? Exactly. So we have Hypothesis integrated directly into the book, and you can choose to turn it on or not to have it, or to have it off in your book. But you can decide the visibility settings of those, where you would like it throughout your book? Do you want it just for chapters? Do you just want it for parts? All of that is customizable amongst other hypothesis features that are available. So with that being said, I will jump into my portion just for the sake of time. Keep leaving your questions in the chat. There's 3 of us here, so we'll try our best to answer all of them. So I just wanted to show you the little bit of the Pressbooks level features for buy-in institutions and to show you what they look like as opposed to having your own network. So when you have your, when you buy into Pressbooks or on a Pressbooks network rather, there will always be a catalog. So this is our test university instance at university.pressbooks.pub. So in this case, this would be, let's say, the state board's institutional network, or if you decide to purchase your own Pressbooks network, this could be your institutional network. At the bottom of all networks, there is a catalog, and this is the network-wide catalog. And if you were to have your own institutional network, then all of these books would be for your institution. But if you were to buy into the state board's network, then all of your books would live in this catalog. There are a couple of ways that you can discern your books, your institution's books from another buy-in's books. And you can obtain that by having an individual catalog. So what that would look like is on the back end of Pressbooks, there, under my books, you will see an option called My Catalog. And just like a regular catalog, you can take in books, take out books. You can see the status of the books, the titles, you can see what's in your catalog. And when I actually go to visit my catalog, you have this individual catalog that exists outside of your network catalog. So you would be able to share this link with all of your students, and all of your institution's texts can live in here. You can customize, as you can see, I've added a Pressbooks image, I've added a description for Pressbooks, and you can see all the books that are inside of my catalog. And upon clicking on them, it will take me directly to the book on my network. So that is an example in which you'd be able to employ the personal catalog, and you'd be able to, let's say that I am the administrator at, just for continuity's sake, let's say I am the administrator at LW Tech, then I would be able to set a user as LW Tech and have that as the URL itself. So there's a variety of ways in which you can denote the individual institutions inside of a larger network. So that is how you would set up that. There are a couple of other ways you can discern your network, or sorry, your institution from the greater network itself. So on the Pressbooks directory, I have this excellent example of using the publisher metadata option. So in this case, you can see that this book was actually, the publisher of this book was Open SUNY Textbooks, so the State University of New York, but it was actually produced on the eCampus Ontario network. So it probably wasn't produced there, but it was probably cloned onto the network. So as you can see, eCampus Ontario has its own network, but this book was published by SUNY. So this is a case in which you would be able to, your book will live if you were to be a buy-in to the state board. Your network up top would be OpenWA at pressbooks.pub, but you can insert your institutional name into the publisher field. And there are 2 different filters for the publisher and the network. So that is where they would differ. So you can see that the publisher, the network field is eCampus Ontario, but the publisher field is Open SUNY Textbooks. So that is how you can identify your book separately as well. And in this case, if I go on to one of the books, the examples of the books, you can see that they've also incorporated their school branding into the book cover itself to denote which institution particularly distributed this book, so that even if it's cloned onto another network, another Pressbooks network, or is adapted anywhere across the web, they know exactly who had published the book. So those are 2 ways to identify or to make known of your institution's work. And lastly, Another example that I've drawn is you can always change the URL of your book so that if you were to buy into the state board, the administrators of that network, so someone like Boyoung, would be able to change the URL of your book to include your institutional name. In this case, like I said, we're using LW Tech as an example. This is not actually their book, but this is, you are able to do this to denote whose book it belongs to, so that if you see another book on the state board's network, you can know which institution that book actually belongs to. And then otherwise, in terms of logistics, Pressbooks, at Pressbooks, we use a triage system for our, I'll stop sharing. At Pressbooks, we use a triage system for our support. I sort of act as the one and only official member of support, so all support inquiries get funneled to me. So for a independent network, if your institution were to have its own network, then you would be able to have 3 support contacts, and you could administer your network, change any of the administrative level settings, change the appearance of your website, your root home site. Whereas if you were to be a buy-in institution into the state board, you would get 1 support contact who would be able to email our support desk. And the triage system being that anyone else from your institution will have to go through you to ask us questions. So those are the fundamental differences between what it's like to be a buy-in institution as opposed to an entirely independent network. So those cover sort of the basics on the difference of what it looks like on Pressbooks itself outside of the contractual agreements. So I see that there are a lot of questions in the chat. So actually Steele has been answering a lot of them. Steele, did you need, is there anything that hasn't been answered? Sarah, is there anything that hasn't been answered?
You should ask the people asking the questions. I try to do my best, but if they don't feel satisfied, let's let them speak up. Yeah.
Excellent. That's a better option. If anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask us.
Hi, Amy. I have a question. Does Pressbooks have the ability to translate into different languages? So if we had a student who is more comfortable in reading in Spanish, could we translate a book into Spanish?
So there's no option to translate a book into Spanish except what your browser will allow. So if you have a book entirely in English, if you have Google Chrome, you can have the translate feature. So Pressbooks itself doesn't have a translation feature, but because there's a web compatible format that can be read on the browser, you can easily find translation services that will automatically do that for you. In terms of writing in different languages, we have different language accommodations. So if you want to change the interface of your reading, so for example, if you want the visual cues, so all of the metadata fields and all of the visual cues like the read book button or the book information heading or the table of contents heading, you can set your book's information so that all of that can be translated into different languages. We have lots of languages available. And I believe we have a resource that states all the languages. And we also offer script support. So if you are writing in a non-Latin based alphabet language, so for example, I'm Korean. So if I want to write my book in Korean, I can declare language and script support for Korean as it uses a completely different alphabet set. And everything in my book would be rendered perfectly depending on the language that I declare for script support. And we have a variety of languages that are available for script support as well. So that is how I would tackle all the different parts of languages that regardless of what you're referring to. Does that sort of answer your question or?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
No worries.
Perhaps if there are no more questions at this particular moment, we could hand it over to Steele maybe to jump in and talk a little bit more about accessibility.
Hi, everybody. It looks like a huge, amazing crowd from Washington. I'm joining you from just south of you. I live in Eugene, Oregon. So hello from the Pacific Northwest to the Pacific Northwest. So I am the product manager at Pressbooks. And I think I was just asked to come and talk a little bit about Pressbooks' efforts towards making a more inclusive and accessible software platform, and also making sure that the content published with Pressbooks is inclusive and accessible to all users. So a few things, someone had already asked a couple of questions about this. So I think Mark, thank you, Mark, was asking about how well or whether we comply with some guidelines for accessibility. So I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the acronym, so I'll try to unpack it a little bit. There are the WCAG guidelines, WCAG. Those are essentially web accessibility guidelines for content creators and tool providers. It's kind of like a global standard for inclusive web content. And they have, at the time that we published a document called the VPAT, the kind of standard level was 2.0, and you could be assessed at the A level or the AA. Federal law and local requirements often require tools to be compliant at the 2.0 AA level. And so when we were looking at our platform, we wanted to make sure that anybody who wanted to make things with Pressbooks could, no matter what their a different ability level was, or comfort with a keyboard or a mouse, or whether they were sighted or unsighted, or whatever their ability level they wanted, we wanted to include them in the software. So we worked with a couple of different organizations to audit our software. We did a third-party accessibility audit, and they identified a bunch of issues that would affect the platform's accessibility. And then we went through and remediated and fixed them. And the organization that we worked with initially is the Inclusive Design Research Center. They're out of OCAD University in Toronto. And we hired them to do the audit and to help us produce the initial VPAT. So the VPAT is a document that just talks about accessibility and the compliance with the guidelines at the 2.0 A and A level. At the time, 2.1 was still relatively new in terms of its standards. So we assessed ourselves against the standards from 2.1 that we felt were most relevant to our platform. And then this year, our plan is to go back through. It looks like 3.0 is in draft form. I'm not sure if we'll wait for 3.0 or just look at 2.1, but we're constantly reassessing accessibility and making sure that our platform is accessible. We have an accessibility statement on the website. We've committed to making sure that anything that we do release now and in the future it complies at the level of 2.0 AA. And we have also worked over the last, probably 18 months with several of your colleagues in Washington at the University of Washington. They have a really great accessibility office, and they performed their own independent audit, and we're just wrapping up the last couple of issues that they identified for us on the platform side. So that's the platform in terms of using Pressbooks to author or publish content. Now, the other really important part of accessibility is making sure that content published with Pressbooks is also accessible to users. And in that case, we do whatever we can on our side to ensure that if someone makes good markup decisions, the output will also be well formatted and accessible. So we have responsibility in certain parts for the structure of the EPUBs and the PDFs and the other things that we make. We produce good markup wherever possible, but it's also important for authors to make good decisions, obviously, when making content. So we have a couple of chapters in our guide, and then there's a number of resources from the community about ensuring that your content is accessible to all. Things like making sure that you're using headers in the right kind of descending order, producing alt tags for images, and other kinds of choices, pretty common or basic choices that people can make to ensure their content's more accessible. That's largely up to the content creator, but we want to make it as easy as possible to choose to make and publish accessible content. So those are some of the things that we have done and that we do in relation to accessibility. I'm not sure if I missed any questions. Let me look at the chat.
I think Mark had asked, are there accessibility checking tools in the authoring environment?
No, so we don't have a built-in accessibility checking tool for content authors. Like, I know that I've seen the one in Canvas, and Blackboard, I think, has the Ally tool now. We don't currently have something like that, but we do have a couple in-browser tools that we do recommend people use. Like the Axe browser tool is compatible with the Pressbooks authoring interface and the output. So there's a couple of free open tools that people can use to check the accessibility of their output, but nothing that's built into the editing interface yet. It'd be a really nice goal for us to do that sometime this year, I think, if we could make it happen.
And also, Anne had asked very earlier on in this chat, are the books accessible for students with disabilities? I had sort of touched on how you could make books more accessible, but I was wondering if you could elaborate on your opinion and your thoughts on how this can be done.
Yeah, great. So the basic question is yes, yeah, books can and should be required to be made accessible to learners with disabilities. That's our obligation under federal law for all of us, and hopefully as inclusive human beings, that's also our obligation. So there's a guide chapter that covers some really top level basic things that we recommend everyone do and look at when they're publishing a book. I don't know, Amy, you could pull that up and drop in the chat, or maybe I could when I'm done talking. It's hard to do two things at once. The other things that we would really recommend in relation to making sure that your content's accessible, thinking about inclusive design also means providing multiple modalities or multiple opportunities for access. So in the Pressbooks universe, the books are going to be web first by default. They'll be available and generally accessible to anyone with an active internet connection. But lots of us know that not all of our students have reliable internet at all times. So what we're trying to make sure is that you can choose to make your books available in many formats. So we support 10 to 12 different export formats, and each of those export formats have ideally are designed to be accessible in different ways. So you can produce an EPUB format or a MOBI format so the book can be read as an ebook. You can produce a PDF that's optimized for print, and we also produce digital PDFs, and the digital PDFs use a PDF format that's tagged for maximum accessibility. So it'll include things, it'll be a tagged PDF that's as accessible as we can make it. So those are some of the things that we do to ensure that the stuff that you make with Pressbooks is as accessible as possible to the people you hope would learn from it. And then Amy did thank you for the links to the guide chapters. For people who really want to dive in deeper, there's a couple of book level resources that I think are really terrific on accessibility. I will find those here in a second when I stop talking and drop those into the chat as well. They were published with Pressbooks, but they're more generally about web accessibility and not specifically Pressbooks.
All right, there were some questions in the chat about connecting to Canvas. So I could maybe take a quick moment to demo what that looks like if you guys are interested in it. But if anyone had specific questions about accessibility, I wanted to make sure that there was room to ask for that. But if not, you can continue to ask your questions within the chat, and then Steele will be available to answer all of those from there. So let me just log into my Canvas account, and then I can share with you a little bit more information about how you can connect your texts into Canvas and various LMSs. So if you're not using Canvas, we do connect with other LMSs such as Blackboard and Moodle and D2L. All right, so I'll take it away and just start sharing my screen here. So as I mentioned in the chat, out of the box with any base subscription to Pressbooks, you will have access to the following export formats up until this check mark here. So what I've got checked off here is a thin common cartridge file with 1.1 web links. So this enables me to download my entire book in a format that can be easily uploaded into an LMS. So what I've done is I've taken let me actually navigate to the book that I've done this for. Blueprint for Success in Career and College. What I've done is I've taken this book, I've exported it as a thin common cartridge file with web links, and then I was able to pull that into my course in Canvas. So what it did when I imported all of that is it set up the parts of my books as modules and then nested all of those chapters underneath as web links here. So when a student goes through to read the content of the book, because it is using web links, that means the content is being embedded into an iframe here. So that's what you're seeing. But the student can go through, read the text from here without ever having to navigate away from the LMS. They would still have access to Hypothesis if you have that enabled on the text. So if they wanted to go through and highlight a section, they could and still take notes directly from here. And then they would always have the option to open up the actual web book if they wanted to look at it without having to read it within an iframe. Now, the other option that you have available to you is the ability to set up an LTI integration between your Pressbooks network and your LMS. So once this is established, what it means is you can now pull in content to your LMS that doesn't necessarily have to be published publicly to the web. Because you've got that LTI connection, you can actually start pulling in private content. And the other really cool thing is one, on Canvas, you get the benefit of not having that clunky gray iframe anymore, but you also have the opportunity to then connect H5P activities into the LMS gradebook. So I've navigated into another course here, and I'm looking at a chapter within this course that has a number of H5P activities embedded throughout. So as the student goes through and reads the chapter and tests out their luck on the various activities in here, oops, sorry, I didn't drop that in the right place. I actually didn't study this section, so looks like I only got one question right there. But what happens when you connect this book into the LMS gradebook, which is an optional decision you have to make there, as an instructor, you can start recording student grades, and students can get immediate feedback within the LMS gradebook to see how they did on a particular section of the course. So you see there, I only got one question right, so I didn't get the full marks. But this updates live, and you're able to give that feedback immediately to your students. And then as an instructor, obviously you'd be able to see the full grade book with all of the students. And I'm just logged in here as a fake student right now. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of what the difference was between the thin common cartridge file with web links versus when you have that full LTI integration. So within Canvas, the thing to note is out of the box, it will live in that iframe. If you have the LTI integration, you remove that, and then you gain the ability to use Pressbooks results, which allows you to connect those H5P activities to the gradebook. So I just wanted to quickly jump in because I saw we had a couple minutes there, and I figured it might be helpful to share that with all of you. All right, I don't think I missed any questions in the chat there. And we've got, oh, what book were you linking to, Sarah? Okay, here I can share my screen again and perhaps share that with you. Okay, so the book I had in here was Blueprint for Success in College and Career. So let me just go back to the book's homepage. So I had taken this book and downloaded it from my Pressbooks network as a thin common cartridge file, and then I pulled that into my LMS. Now, when I was playing around with this book, it's just a short little book that I created that just had 3 chapters, 2 of which I pulled in as assignments so that they could be graded, one of which is simply an LTI link. So this is not a graded chapter. And that's just because of the settings that I played around with. This is just a text that has 3 very different chapters, one which is a Portuguese lesson, the next which is the anatomy of skin lesson, and the third there was a poetry assignment from a course that I believe Steele used to teach with. But if you'd like links to where this content originally came from, for example, if you're interested in anatomy texts, we can definitely share with you the full book for where those chapters came from. And yes, all of the books that are published openly are available to you, even if you don't buy into Pressbooks. So that's the beauty of open. You have full free access to our Pressbooks directory, which will help you search and discover all of this content. And you can do keyword searches to find books that are relevant to the subject that you're teaching in. And any content you find on there is going to be free for you to use. So even if you don't choose to go with Pressbooks, you can still teach with these great books and these high quality books out there. And all you need to do is make sure that you provide the link to the book to your students, and then all of your students will be able to read that content online. The main benefit of Pressbooks is if you wanted to take that existing content and own a copy yourself and have the ability to remix it and adapt it, and for example, have access to all of those export formats, that might be a case where it becomes a little bit more interesting to own your own copy. But the short answer is yes, you can use these books for free as is right now. All right, so we've got some time here for more questions. Feel free to continue adding them in the chat if you don't want to unmute yourself. But if you do have the courage to unmute yourself, you're more than welcome to. We've got about 8 minutes left here to go over anything you'd like.
I have a question about the, was it MathJack bits? And sorry, the technology side of this is completely over my head. So I hope this question makes sense. But in terms of Canvas integration and the, like the quiz tools and things like that, does that, accessibility around mathematical notation, does that carry over into the Canvas integration? So if you have a quiz question with algebraic formulas and things like that, does that all sort of retain the ability to be read by a screen reader and things like that?
So Steele, can I let you take that one?
Sure, I can take that one. Yes. So the short answer is yes. You can use MathJax inside of H5P activities, for example. So if you wanted to render a mathematical expression inside of a quiz question, then you could write it with LaTeX, and H5P would be rendered inside the browser using that MathJax JavaScript library. So yes, the math should be accessible all the way down. Yes, is the short answer.
Excellent, thank you.
Math is one of the more complicated things. You have one of the world's leading experts on math on the web in this call. In fact, David Lippman was asking questions earlier. So I should say, as with everything, the math notation world is a very large and complicated one. You may find that H5P is not the perfect tool to do all of the kind of mathematical assessments that you want. In fact, that's probably true. But if H5P can render it and represent it, it should be able to do it with accessible math, yes.
Steele, there are a couple of questions in the chat. Firstly being, when using a screen reader, do you need a math player to read the math?
I'm not sure if I know, Anne, can you help me understand what you mean by a math player?
When I've looked into creating accessible math, I've been always told that you can use the MathJax to create the accessible, but that the, like JAWS and NVDA won't read it. And they needed another piece of software, which in the past, I don't know if it still exists, as Math Player. Luckily, I haven't had any blind students recently that have taken math. They kind of avoided it at my institution, but I just thought I would throw that out there.
So I think what typically happens, at least for the limited accessibility testing that I have done with JAWS or with VoiceOver, usually what will happen is there will be a mathematical expression that will be read aloud by the browser. And there's several different ways that the user can configure their software to read the math expression. And when Sarah was showing you that interface, you can also choose how the output is rendered in the browser too. So the user could say, I prefer this to be rendered in HTML. I prefer it to be rendered in MathML if your browser supports it. So typically, I think if the person is an unsighted user that's used to reading with math, they'll probably have the tool configured to produce the auditory output that they want. And generally speaking, MathJax is pretty compatible with those. But if there's a specific case I'm not aware of, we're happy to look more into it and find an answer. Again, the world of accessibility testing is very large, and my knowledge of it is not as enormous as it could be.
There's another question which says, do you know the way that Lumen also provides automatic directive feedback that is triggered for certain quiz scores or questions answered incorrect?
So when you're building activities with H5P, you can produce hints and tips, and you can also provide feedback. And the feedback can be, most of the question types will allow you to program feedback for correct answers, for wrong answers, and also kind of some summative feedback. So typically, most of those H5P assessments will allow you to do that kind of specific feedback based on the user's response for most of those questions. Now, it involves you setting up the question and adding the responses that you want to show them. But yes, that's totally supported with the H5P integration in Pressbooks, yes. There was a question about iframes. So iframes can cause accessibility barriers, yes, depending on how they're rendered and displayed. What's happening in the LTI world is Canvas essentially is providing an HTML wrapper, and what we're doing is we're just putting the Pressbooks webbook inside of the Canvas iframe. So the screen reader typically will just say, oh, look, there's an iframe, and then they jump into it and they're experiencing the DOM object of the Pressbooks page with the well-formatted markup. So it's like them reading the book in the native environment, just within the shell of Canvas. So it depends on what you're iframing, I think, which is true for the accessibility barriers generally. But the users ought to have an accessible experience when viewing an accessible Pressbooks webbook inside of the LMS. But that's a good question, Ty.
There's another question in the chat there, Steele asking if you can change the size of a YouTube video when you embed it into your chapter.
I'm not 100% sure. I think you can specify in the iframe itself the display size. We have a resizer that's built in to make it kind of fluid width, and so I'm not sure what happens if you. Amy might know the answer better than I do about that.
I feel like from previous experience, we have a default size for the OEmbed possibility for YouTube videos. So for those of you who are not aware, because Pressbooks is built on top of WordPress, all of the OEmbed allowed domains that WordPress has, we also accept on Pressbooks. So that means you can copy and paste the URL directly from the link itself and copy it into your Pressbooks book. And just, you don't need a specific iframe code. You can just embed the content using the watch URL that you're watching on your browser. But I think that if you were to iframe the content using the embed code that YouTube provides, you might be able to resize it without it defaulting to the size of the video itself.
I wanted to say as well, whoever organized this, I mean, Bo Young probably, but I joined this thing and I was blown away to see something like 50-something people. So well done, whatever you're doing in Washington. Very impressive to see so many people engaged with open content and teaching and learning.
Yeah, thank you so much for setting this up, Bo Young. I really appreciate it. And I'll make sure to share with you that shareable PDF so that you can send it to everyone who joined in today for what the pricing looks like. I can also send a formal pricing proposal for what the pricing is if you were to opt into a Pressbooks network outside of the Washington State Board's central network. And I can also give a quick summary of what the differences are there between buying into a central network versus getting your own institutional license.
And I will send the recording in a nice package with that ready PDF and any other content or resources that you would like made available to the Washington community. But yes, thank you so much to everyone for coming and for having us.